Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm Max Carter. I'm the chairman of 20th and 21st Century Art here at Christie's. We're very honored to have with us the great and evidently very popular Jed Perl. Jed was the art critic at the New Republic for 20 years when it was good. He's the author of many books, including Paris Without End, the 2-volume biography of Alexander Calder, and one of my favorite books about both art and New York, New Art City, Manhattan, and Mid-Century, which I encourage those of you who haven't read it to read. This is a bit of a tangent, but I went to boarding school. Boarding school was wonderful for me in many ways, but regarding art and culture, it was like living in a cave for 5 years. And when I was there, my dad, who's here tonight, gave me a subscription to the New Republic, and reading Jed's criticism was like your wisest, most interesting, engaging friend speaking directly to you about art and books and ideas. And I feel the same way 25 years later, so this is a great honor. So thank you, Jed.
Are they on?
It's on.
I'm on? Okay. Thank you.
We're very honored, incredibly honored at Christie's this season to offer and to celebrate the collection of Robert and Patricia Weis. Thank you so much, Colleen, Jennifer, Jonathan, who I don't know is here tonight. We are so honored. We see many things at Christie's. Our visit to the Weis home in Sunbury, Pennsylvania was unforgettable. There's a small number of mythical private collections at Christie's which people whisper about, but the Weis collection was so private that we didn't even know what we're missing. So when we finally got there, and those who were honored enough to go to the house in 4 small, elegantly appointed rooms, you followed this 50-year journey, or more than 50-year journey, of careful, patient study and thought and scholarship and collecting. And I didn't know your parents, but you really felt like you were with them on this journey. And in parallel, there was a similar more than 50-year journey of modern art. If not, it was a story of modernism, if not the story, from the Fauves to abstract expressionism and in the garden beyond to pop art. So tonight, I'd like to take you on that journey with Jed, briefly, very briefly. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So we have just housekeeping on the chairs. You should have the basic details for the works we're going to discuss tonight, which are being sold on Monday. This will hopefully do most of the heavy lifting for us. You can follow along visually as we go. We have 2 images behind us just to give you a sense of what this really magical home is like. Right behind me is the living room, where you see the Matisse, the Leger, and the Picasso, and behind Jed is the hallway beyond with the Rothko, Ernst, and Mondrian. So
Maybe the way my involvement with this collection started was Max sent me an email saying, would you come to Christie's and look at something? And I had no idea what it was. And I came into a room and there were these paintings, each one very different from the one next to it. Not everything you're seeing here was there, but there was a Rothko, there was a Matisse, there was, I think the Brock was there. And what was so interesting about the collection, and became more interesting as I began to find out more about it, was that the Weises had collected the entire gamut. It was as if it was an encyclopedia of what modern artists had done since the very beginning of the 20th century. So, there are often collectors kind of go down one avenue. Collector will collect surrealism or cubism or abstract expressionism, but the Weises collected each of those kinds of things, and that made it fascinating. And obviously they were always looking for a kind of prime, fascinating, a very special example of each.
Well, and if you, I mean, you can't do this perfectly, but if you map out when they were buying things, it sort of progresses chronologically as well. One of the first things they bought in 1971, which I think is the 5th lot in the sale, if you want to flip to that page, this painting here was the Fauve Brock, which is in the dining room, and that's where you sort of start the journey, physically, art historically. We want everyone to be on the same page tonight, so I'm going to start by asking Jed what I'm sure at least someone in here is wondering, which is, what is a Fauve, who is Brock, and what is he up to in 1907?
Well, Fauvism, like a number of modern movements in art.
Oh, Jack, can you turn your mic on?
Oh,
You just flip that up.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Fauvism, like a number of major modern movements, was named by somebody who didn't like it. Fauve was actually a pejorative originally, wild beast. It was a critic who didn't like what Matisse and Dufy and Braque and some other people were doing. The Fauves, you might say, turned up the energy, the intensity on color. And one of the questions people always ask about modern art is, when does it start? Some people say it starts way in the 19th century with Manet. Some people say Cézanne around 1900. There is also an argument that can be made for the Fauvism of 1905, the Braque is 1907. But wherever modernism starts, wherever modern art starts, I think there's an important idea you have to keep in mind. I think this is key to understanding everything about the Weis collection. Art from the Renaissance was about seeing our world, seeing the world, the universe as we know it. At some point between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, artists start to think about creating what I would call parallel universes, alternate parallel universes. They use parts of the world we see around, because what else is there to work with? Colors, shapes, forms, figures. And what the Fauves did was take the intensity of an experience. Braque is here in the south of France on the Mediterranean coast with that very intense light. And he's trying to capture not exactly what he sees, but the sensation of light. So you have these very high-keyed kind of colors and contrasting and complementary colors kind of bouncing off each other and exploding. So what you have is a kind of parallel world of the sort of sensuality of light and sun and heat.
And this is a reaction in part to pointillism, to divisionism.
Right. I mean, you can always keep going.
But that's, I suppose, no, because Matisse, who's represented here in 1937, is, of course, the ringleader of the Fauves, and Matisse, who briefly dabbles in post-impressionism when he comes to Paris, felt that the divisionism, which is, the scientific application of dots and strokes and complementary colors that Seurat and Signac popularized, but that offered only retinal pleasures. It was really just about the eye. Then he wanted, as you say, to create a universe that was more personal, more primal.
Right. Well, it's also, in the Renaissance, theorists talked about the idea of a painting being a kind of parallel to a window. The rectangle of a painting enclosed a world that was very much in some way like the world we know. And when you think of Seurat, thank you, sir. If you think of Seurat, who uses these little dots and dashes of color, he's still holding onto the contours of things. He's also dealing in light and dark in the way, dark and light we see in the world around us. The same is true of Cézanne. And what happens in the first years of the 20th century, and Braque and Picasso and Matisse are key to this, is they sort of jump off further. I sometimes think that we use the word modernism about 20th century art, but sometimes I think a better word to cover actually a lot of the stuff in the Weis collection is the idea of symbolism in some sense. That in other words, the painting is a kind of complexity of symbols of the world. It's a kind of symbolic language that uses, again, elements of the world, we know it, but transforms them, plays with them.
Although, so the collection, it skips over what is one of the more, Cubism, which you would think would carry that over. I can't get in your parents' minds, but I feel like that rejection of what is strictly about the eye applies in some way to Cubism, because of course, notwithstanding the 1920 Leger, the collection then sort of lands, you go from the Braque and you land in the 1930s in Paris with Matisse and Picasso, who are arguably at the height of their powers.
Right.
Each could claim to be the greatest living painter, sculptor, draftsman.
You've got the Matisse, which is 37, and the Picasso's
32.
So which hung in the living room. And Matisse and Picasso, so this is the 30s, when they're at this point internationally famous. But these men started out as very risky figures. They were risk takers, and in their early years, there was very little attention paid to them. Collectors were thin on the ground for them early on. One of the fascinating things about Matisse and Picasso is, by the 30s, really by the middle of the 20s, the world is completely open to them. They can do whatever they want. They get immensely high prices for things. But neither of these artists, and they lived a very, very long time. Matisse died in the early 50s. Picasso died in
73.
Yeah, I mean, they lived an incredibly long time. They were lionized, but they preserved to the end of their lives the kind of gutsy experimental spirit that they'd had as young men. They were constantly, both of these men were constantly trying new things and different things. And that's very, I mean, that's very unusual in a career, you know, to go higher and higher and never feel inhibited by, oh, this is the kind of thing you do. They kept changing. Matisse, at the end of his life, becomes virtually an abstract artist, and in some cases, an abstract artist. Picasso does all kinds of, I mean, he's a change artist. In fact, some people criticize Picasso for having tried too many different things. They say, who's the real Picasso? But I mean, and both these paintings show these men in very, very bold experimental periods, but their lives are just a succession of periods.
Well, the Matisse, I think he's 68 when he paints. It's 1937, and he refers in the mid-30s to going back into the jungle where he'd been in the Fauve years. He does these very celebrated paintings in Nice of interiors, but this is where, he, as you say, he's doing something that is experimental and it's different. He's looking at Picasso. How much are these artists painting and creating in isolation at this point, and how much are they looking at one another, measuring against one another?
I mean, I think these are artists who are constantly taking from their contemporaries, from older things. I think there's sometimes a little bit of a danger of getting too much into a Picasso-Matisse rivalry. There was a big show at MoMA, was it 20 years ago, that I think maybe
We have John here who can tell us. Yeah.
sort of made that, sharpened that too much. Picasso was famous for stealing. I mean, there's a story about Giacometti getting ready to leave Paris on a trip, and Picasso kept saying, I want to come over, see what you're doing. And Giacometti was very intent on making sure his studio was locked tight before he left, because not only would Picasso come and take ideas from you, but Picasso was so fast, so Giacometti would be working on a sculpture for 5 years, and Picasso would have done like 20 in 6 months. But they're very, I mean, they're both absorbing constantly, but very sure of who they are. I mean, I think that's always key to creative people. And I mean, Matisse in the 20s, and right around the time, right after World War I, had shocked a lot of his most ardent fans by having what some people, I think, mistakenly call the conservative period, where after simplifying and simplifying shapes and figures, he then became interested in saying, well, can I do a really beautifully modeled figure, almost like Raphael might have done? And he did that for a number of years. And in this work here from 37, you see him, again, in a way, going back to what he was doing in 1913, 14, 15, but also in a different. But it's interesting, as an older man, I mean, I sometimes think, the Red Studio in the Museum of Modern Art, which all of you know, which is sort of, that's sort of, I think, Matisse in his kind of reckless, what the hell, very simplified period. And not that it's not complicated, but it's complicated in a simplified way. And here, in his 60s, I think he's going back into some of those efforts to trim things down, but as somebody with all kinds of other experience. So it's very interesting.
Well, it's a deceptively simple painting, because this is a period when Matisse is photographing the various states of his paintings. This is one where
Right.
we see a previous state. He paints it over a number of months. And in the earlier state, the jawline of the ochre figure in the lower right is different. He streamlines it here. There's actually a self-portrait in the upper right of the earlier state, which he's painted over. He's simplified the flowers. To get to this level of simplicity takes 68 years of, it's something that takes lots of practice. And whereas, the Picasso probably was painted over 2 days. I think he inscribes it on the back. So as Jed says, he's very fast.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing about the Matisse, I mean, they're also, one of the things about these guys is, in a way it seems very blunt and direct, but there are also some very deep ideas, like you have a figure in the foreground in the Matisse, which almost looks like a sculptured head, but is a figure. And then you have drawings of heads behind. And this is goes back to the Renaissance, these discussions of is the sculptural or the pictorial, is the flat plane, is painting or sculpture two-dimensional, three-dimensional, what is superior for an artist? And he's kind of tapping into those kinds of discussions, those kind of ideas about what can the arts do. And then in the Picasso, this is a period. This is a portrait of Marie-Thérèse Walter, this young woman who Picasso was absolutely obsessed with for a couple of years. And Picasso, it's like people. There's a lot of things said about Picasso and women, but one of the fascinating things about Picasso is first of all, he was involved with some extraordinarily intellectually significant women. Dora Maar was a figure among the Surrealists before he got involved with her. Françoise Gillot was with it. Went on to write one of the key books, smartest books about him. When Picasso got involved with a woman, she wasn't just a model. She wasn't just a shape. She was a personality. She was, in the most profound sense, a muse, somebody who he felt accessed for him certain aspects of the imagination and the world. And Marie-Thérèse Walter was one of these figures for him. And simultaneously, when he's doing these paintings of her, he's also doing an extraordinary series of sculptures of her in which he's channeling classical Greco-Roman sculptural forms, because he saw in her profile, in her head, something that seemed very much to him like these Greco-Roman figures. And that's a kind of fascinating thing where when he actually just encountered her on the street, and he tells her he's Picasso. She doesn't know who Picasso is, and he takes her into a bookstore to show her a book about him. that he's
That's me. That
he's somebody. But so she's a person with a particular kind of personality and quality, a kind of inwardness, a kind of meditative quality which you feel in this painting. But she also, for him, is Aphrodite. She's all these goddesses, and you feel that. And the fascinating, she's reading here. Okay, this is I said to Max, this whole idea of a woman reading. I mean, there are these great paintings by Corot, the great 19th century painter, many paintings of women reading, which Picasso liked. He collected Corot, and you actually, in the catalog, you've illustrated one or two, and it's amazing, because Picasso is channeling the classical Greek. He's channeling this sort of whole idea of the woman reading, and of course, reading is this kind of contemplative, meditative state. And when I was thinking about the paint, I think it's also that becomes a kind of doppelganger of the art, because isn't the artist a kind of contemplator? I think we sometimes underestimate the extent to which Picasso was in a real kind of synergy and kind of mutual kind of comprehension of things with these women.
Well, it was an extremely secretive, I mean, as Jed says, he was obsessed with her, but this was someone who was not known even to his wife at the time until his retrospective in 1932, when there was all of these paintings of this woman who had a very distinct profile that was not his wife's. Her name wasn't even known to the public until 30 years later, until when Françoise Gillot wrote her great book about Picasso. So this was an intensely private relationship. This is an intensely private painting. So in 1932, when Picasso is 50, of course, Matisse has a retrospective the year before, 1931, at Galerie Georges Petit. It's a huge success. Picasso, of course, wants to do the same thing and to do one better. He has a retrospective in 1932, which he paints a lot of these Marie tries portraits for, and this is later that summer when he's lionized, he's on sort of the top, the apogee, and he paints this in August in private. He keeps it until 1966, so it's again a sort of more of a private document. And again, as you say about sculpture, I mean, the Matisse synthesizes or incorporates all of these ideas. The Picasso also has that wonderful sculptural outline. The head feels bust-like. You see the underdrawing, and of course that deft and light touch of color that the painter.
Just apropos of Picasso and women, the woman who was married to at that time was a ballerina. She had been with the Ballet Russe, and at a time when Picasso was very interested in that world, the world of the theater. And again, it was a marriage kind of within this whole world, which fascinated him for a time. And then Picasso had this kind of love-hate relationship with the kind of high society and bohemia, and he kind of went back and forth. And I think friends from one world would say, like, what happened, like when his first early bohemian friends, when he got involved with the Ballet Russe and that kind of glitterary social world, they were like, what happened to you?
Cocktail.
And then later he reached, then in the late 30s, he gets involved with Dora Maar, and he's then with the sort of surrealist bohemians again. He kind of goes, he's always looking for different sides of who he is, I think, is really.
So we're in the 1930s. Matisse, I think in 1935, right before he paints this, says with, I think, a little bit of self-interest or self-regard that anything that was any good in modern art over the last 50 years was painted in Paris or done in Paris. Then everything everywhere else was derivative and halting and timid or whatever. Of course, that is all about to radically change with the Second World War. In the Weis home, you're in this magical space with the Matisse, the Picasso, and the Legend in the middle, and you moved out, and you moved into this room, into the hallway, and you're transported into New York of the 40s and 50s, where the center of gravity had changed. You're flanked as you come in with the Mondrian on your left and the Max Ernst on your right, arguably the two most important artists in exile in New York. They both left Europe. The Mondrian, and that's somewhere, I forget what lot it is, but it's somewhere in there if you want to look closely at it, but it's one of a rare series of 17 paintings that he begins in Europe, that he finishes in New York. It's very deliberately dated 1939 to 1941. And the Ernst on the right, he sculpts in Long Island, and it's for a show that Julian Levy put on up on 57th Street called The Imagery of Chess. The dimensions of the sculpture were determined by the service elevator there. It's a very New York object. This is a period that Jed has written better about than I think anyone. But Jed, how much are these works that European artists happen to be creating by virtue of circumstance in and around New York, and how much of these things could they have only been created in New York in this new world?
Well, you took.
Well, I mean, Mondrian, Ernst, these artists who were sort of at the first generation of exile.
I think these two figures are really, they are linchpin kind of pivot figures. I mean, the Ernst to me is very cool. I mean, I think because of the occasion for which it was created, Julian Levy, who was a pioneering dealer in surrealism, actually was the first person to show Calder's abstract sculpture in New York. He had this idea during the war of doing a show about chess. A lot of the surrealists were very involved, and the Dadaists were very involved in chess playing. And Ernst created this sculpture, which is this kind of weird upside down to me chess world where, the queen is really that's the central figure in chess. But here, the king, who's kind of not, has taken on a real life, it's almost like Alice in Wonderland, and he's manipulating the queen. To me, the whole fascination of chess in this period has to do with the period we're talking about, World War II. I mean, chess is a game of organized warfare, okay? World War II was not organized. I mean, the Nazis are, you know, they're exterminating millions of people. World War II was chaos. And I think that for the surrealists, who were of course fascinated by the irrational and the break with the norm, and maybe you know, a lot of these who have been communists, who are in danger in Europe, they're in America because Europe has erupted in strangeness that they had never even dreamed of or had hoped they would have to dream of after the catastrophe of World War I. And I think to play chess and play around with chess was, I suppose it was a way of sort of, in a controlled way, imagining battles and chaos that just took place. And to me, this Ernst thing where suddenly the king, who's kind of like, can make a few moves, he's like, kaboom! He's exploded. I mean, think of it, it's like a Hitler emerging or something. So I that to me is what. Mondrian is a really interesting case. The American artists, they'd seen a few Mondrians by the 30s. There were a few in New York. And they saw reproductions. They were always madly reading the magazines from Europe. But Mondrian, Mondrian was a unique figure, and he comes to New York. There are a few artists who start to really follow him closely and work in his manner with the verticals. So Ilya Bolotowsky, Burgoyne Diller, but most of the artists in New York, and certainly most of the ones we know well among the abstract expressionists, they did not choose to work in what you would call his manner, his style, but Mondrian was a thrilling presence to have in New York, because this is a man who from the 1920s had simply believed in his parallel universe and had simply stuck with it. And he was actually a lovely man. He was a warm man.
Great dancer.
He was a great dancer. He liked jazz. He was curious about people. He's actually the person who told Peggy Guggenheim to show Jackson Pollock. He was curious about other kinds of art. And he knew who he was as an artist. And many people who had no desire to paint like him, he was this kind of beacon of a kind of seriousness and probity. And he had his first one-man show in New York. He'd never had a whole show of his own work. I mean, you could buy a Mondrian for a few hundred, dollars when he was alive in New York. But he was this kind of, he was the kind of pure essence of that European independence and daring, you know. And for them to run into him in an opening, to have him in this city working in a studio in this neighborhood was thrilling. And he loved New York. And his late paintings are salutes, Broadway Boogie Woogie, is, you know, the last.
When he actually, for those of you who came from Brooklyn tonight, he's buried in Cypress Hills. He lived here until the rest of his life. Ernst left in the 50s, but Mondrian stayed here. And actually, the Ernst, just the fact that we have it at all is a miracle, because after the show, just the plaster was exhibited. They were going to throw it away, and Robert Motherwell threw it in the back of his car and kept it in his garage for 15 years, and then they cast it eventually. So could have gone the way of the original Duchamp fountain.
But it was thrilling. Part of the thrill for American artists was they knew about these people. They'd seen their work. There were many, in the Depression years, there were a lot of American artists, people like Gorky, who were very sophisticated about what was going on in Europe, although they didn't see a lot of it firsthand. They saw more than you might imagine. But for them to have these people actually here was amazing.
Well, so just beyond the Ernst, you have the Weis is hung the great 1958 Rothko. This is in the late 50s. I think one of his friend John Fisher said he was famous but not yet rich. He'd established himself. 1958 is the year he's commissioned to do the Seagram's murals. What is, I mean, Rothko is, of course, an exile, a different kind of exile, a much earlier, someone who started practicing in New York. But what is Rothko's achievement in the 50s, and to what extent is he assimilating or rejecting Picasso, Matisse, Mondrian?
Interesting. He talked about, in interviews, about Matisse's Red Studio as being revelatory for him, that a painting where the entire surface, end to end, is this resonance of red, and everything else is sort of subsumed in that. I mean, this whole thing of what is American and American art is such a tricky question, and of course, and it gets into this as well. Do we think it's American because it's done in America, or in fact, is there something American in it? I mean, I think there is a quality in some of the Americans of not that tradition doesn't matter, but that the relationship to tradition is different. The whole kind of range, for someone like Picasso, Don Quixote and Spanish culture is, it's like right there. It's like got him by the arm. And Matisse was very interested in Pascal. I mean, French philosophy, the French prose, the kind of elegance, the correctness of French culture. And some of the Americans, I think Rothko is one of these people, there isn't in America that kind of deep kind of cultural situation or environment or ambience. So you're freer. I mean, I think if you think of Whitman and the idea of the Whitman-esque, of these kind of long, crazy poems that kind of just go on and on about how great it is to be walking in the streets of New York or be on the Staten Island Ferry, that there's a kind of a freeness from constraints that I think is in some ways American, though you don't feel it in Gorky in the way you feel it in. I mean, and some people talk about Gorky as being more European,
more of a hint,
right, in that sense. But that mean maybe that's not the way. I mean, those are like all these kind of adjectival uses of national things are interesting. But there is, I mean, the sense in Rothko, in a Rothko like this one where that whole thing of the edges blurring, of it's kind of just maybe keeping on going. And Greenberg had this when he talked about the color field painters after Rothko, who he loved. He talked about how the painting, like in Morris Louis, would start to sort of kind of almost bleed beyond the edges of the canvas. I always felt a little bit, I don't, maybe, but I think there's a sense of certainly not feeling the constraints of the rectangle the way the Europeans do. I mean, that's where, I mean, Pollock seems to, in certain, kind of, I mean, not always, but sometimes Pollock seems very constrained, but some are pushing off.
Yeah, the boundaries of easel painting.
Boundaries, yeah, and you could attach that to the sort of boundlessness of America. Again, I think you have to, as with all these things, sort of, it becomes kind of BS if you don't.
Well, so Jed references Gorky. There's a great Gorky drawing that hung just opposite the Mondrian on the other side here, and just through in the room beyond, in the den in the library, was the great 1961 Klein. You have this great abstract expressionist moment, as I say, the Wesselman in the Garden Beyond gives you that little sort of pop epilogue to this. But with the abstract expressionist, I just loved how everything was hung and displayed in the house, because I felt like, consciously or not, it reflected what was happening then. I mean, even the way that Ernst and the Rothko were so close together, they were said to have met, not formally at a dinner party, they met on the boat back from Ellis Island, where they'd both been picking up people from Europe. And then the abstract expressionists are all hung slightly further apart. And when Braque, late in life, was asked to describe the invention of Cubism with Picasso, he likened it to two mountain climbers linked by a safety rope. And conversely, with the abstract expressionists, and you can tell me whether this is BS or not, if this is myth, but James Breslin, who's Rothko's great biographer, said it was a similar, used the mountain climber analogy, but said that Rothko and his contemporaries were like a dozen well-spaced climbers, all scaling the same sheer cliff, but independently on their own. And there's this sense of loneliness and this sort of heroic struggle. Was that the case in New York? Was it different? Was it less comradely? Was it?
I mean, cafe life in Paris, I mean, you see it even today. I mean,
Yeah.
Cafe life, there's a kind of life lived outside of the home. And I mean, people even at lunch, in ordinary neighborhoods in Paris, at lunch, people gather in a way and sit and actually have lunch at a table with silverware. But I think there was an amazing sense of community. I mean, one of the interesting differences between the visual arts and the literary arts is great writers can kind of be off God knows where in the country all the time. I mean, you can be an Emily Dickinson. There aren't exactly Emily Dickinsons in the visual arts. I mean, the visual arts, the studio, the atelier kind of is somehow a place, it's a place to be alone, but there's also maybe because it's visual, I think urbanism and the visual arts have always had this kind of critical connection. I think one of the things that was hard for the abstract expressionists, these people, I mean, people like Rothko, these people were dirt poor. They were starving in the 30s, basically. And after it's 48, 49, 50, there is an explosion. And the 50s, things come very fast, and I think there is a sense that nobody quite knows what to do with it, which is part of what you're talking about. In Europe, how to be an artist, and even a well-known artist, or a famous artist, was something that there were models. I mean, people like Delacroix or Corot, they were very famous, but they also, as I was saying with Picasso, knew how to pursue their own vision in a very independent way. I think one of the things that happened in America was, the kind of the explosion of American prosperity and the transformation of America really after the war into, this incredibly prosperous country. It was hard to cope with. Certainly Rothko felt that. I mean, a lot of them kind of went to pieces in one way or another. And I think in Europe, there was more of a model of how to kind of manage all that. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I wrote this, as Max said, this 2-volume biography of Calder, and people forget Calder had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943, and at that point, he was still writing his dealer, who was Kurt Valentin, like, do you have an extra $100? Because we have absolutely no money to pay for the kid has the flu and we need to pay the doctor. It was not until well into the 50s that Calder, who had a tremendously successful retrospective modern in the 40s, it was not until the late 50s that suddenly the money started coming in. And then in the 60s, of course, and they struggled to remain themselves, kind of a bohemian couple. But I think the shock for a lot of the Americans in the 50s was just, and that kind of pulls people apart. Yeah, I mean.
That makes sense. I've got one more question before we turn it over to hopefully questions from the audience, and this is going to be slightly silly, but I think about this a lot, and I think I thought about this in relation to the collection, but just around this time in the 1950s, Isaiah Berlin popularized the ancient Greek distinction between the hedgehog that knows one great thing and the fox that knows many things. According to Berlin, Dante and Plato were hedgehogs, Aristotle and Shakespeare were foxes. Who among the Weis artists are the hedgehogs? Because Rothko, I think, is a hedgehog, but I would love to know who falls in which side.
Well, I think we agreed on the phone today that Mondrian of these people is
the ultimate hedgehog.
I mean, he's in some way a platonic figure. He pursues an ideal, and I think Picasso is the ultimate fox who just.
Matisse is fox-like too.
What?
Matisse is fox-like.
He's fox-like, but with a kind of, I think Matisse yearns for an absolute. I think I think the yearning for an absolute, a kind of a final solution. I mean, Matisse keeps finding what he thinks are final, like in those, like I'll take 50 photographs and then that's the other, but then the next week he has to. I think Picasso had no interest in final. Picasso's a process artist. That's why he's such a great printmaker. I mean, yeah.
Well, no, it's true because Matisse. I mean, Matisse famously said he loved everything he ever did, everything that he let out into the world, but there was not a single thing that he wouldn't redo differently at that point. He was headed for the same end goal.
I mean, in a way, you can play with Apollonian as Dionysian, the Nietzsche thing, in the same way that the kind of Apollonian yearning for some kind of whole, beautiful wholeness, and then I guess Matisse would be that, and Picasso is certainly the Dionysian, who there's nothing that he doesn't represent.
Does anyone have any questions? No questions to. Okay, while we wait, then I've got one. Just because. Please, Dad.
You know what was their first picture that's in this collection?
Well, Colleen and Jennifer can correct this. I think of the works in the evening sale, I think the Brock was, but I think there was maybe some American paintings, maybe the Hartleys before that.
Some of the early ones are the ones you're seeing in front of you on the left. The three, I think those are from 1963 by Picasso.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And then I think the Avery. Probably
The Avery, yeah, the American stuff. Yeah.
Right. There's a small one. There's a woman in blue ahead of us. She's by the artist Carl Springhorn.
Yeah.
Our father was an executor of his estate, and those were very early. And that's a woman. The title is "The Woman Who Collected Matisses."
Wow.
I did Matisse.
Well, and actually, Avery, who was one of the Rothko's great influences, who Rothko said was the first artist who he saw being an artist 24 hours a day and gave him this belief.
Well, and the fact that your parents knew artists, I think, is very significant here. I mean, I think I think a lot of the most serious and deepest collectors, in a way, are also people who knew and care. I mean, that's Peggy Guggenheim, who knew all. I mean, I think it's natural to want to. Both, if you know some artists, to want to share their work and have it, and vice versa. If you really love painting, to want to know something of these people who do this.
Please.
Since you are expert in Calder, I read actually Sandy Calder told me a story about Mondrian and Calder. He said Calder went to visit studio of Mondrian. I forgot which year, but he was very inspired by the space.
Yes.
Maybe you can repeat the question, just because I.
Yes. The question is about Calder's experience when he went to Mondrian's studio, 1930, I believe. Calder began as a what he called a wire. He did wire sculptures of athletes and performers and circus people, and he created the circus, which you all know from, which is now in static at the Whitney, unfortunately. But he performed it. That was his sort of calling card in Paris, where he first went in 1926. And by the late 20s, he's now in a circle of people, of abstract artists or abstract influenced artists, and Mondrian comes to one of these performances of his circus, and he then goes to Mondrian's studio. And Mondrian's studio in Paris was, again, a mecca, as Mondrian's studio was in New York. It was a very weird apartment where it was kind of actually the two buildings, the rooms were in two different buildings. You sort of you went through a dark passage, and you came into a room that was lit very surprisingly from several sides, very bright, and there would be one or two Mondrian paintings. And then on the walls were rectangles of color, which Mondrian moved around to be pinned to the wall, experimenting with compositions. And he also had these ideas about environments, which he never really did, but he thought about it a lot. And Calder went in there, and this was the sort of, he talked about it later as like, a kind of knock on the head or being reborn. And he suddenly saw a way to be an abstract artist in a very visceral way. This room was like this kind of miraculous initiation for him. And he, and actually back in New York, when everybody landed back in New York, when the war came, Calder was one of the people who was called the night Mondrian died in the hospital. There were a small group of friends, a man named Harry Holtzman, who had been Mondrian's
executor.
And
I think Stuart Davis maybe was there.
I'm not sure about that. And they were there at the bed after he died, very early in the morning, and then they went to Schraff's, I believe, and they sat and had coffee and talked about this man. So, I mean, yes, but Mondrian, Calder was not one to say, oh, I really owed this or that to this or that person. But Mondrian, he absolutely acknowledged.
Actually,
Yeah.
so otherwise it's truly actually exposed on the side.
Yeah, he said, I mean, he said, oh, you should make them move. And Mondrian said, well, they move already, because when you look at a Mondrian, your eye moves from this blue to this red to this, and indeed, in different ones, you think of the late ones, the Broadway boogie woogie, your eye moves very fast. So there is, a Mondrian is not static, you move through it. But the other funny thing is, the first moving sculptures that Calder made were not the wind-driven mobiles, they actually had motors. And Mondrian came in Paris to a show of these first motor-driven Calders, and he said to Calder, they're not moving fast enough. So he got his back. Anyway, about that.
But in no one asked, how about relationship among them to Steiner?
To who?
Without Steiner.
Oh, I think we shouldn't go in. Let's not go into what Mondrian's mystical thoughts were and that were not yet. Hi.
Among all the pieces from the collection, one of my favorites is Arshil Gorky drawing from 1946. And I think it's really good period. And I mean, one thing that I found like common between Arshil Gorky and Van Gogh, like they both killed themselves, and then they made one of the best pieces 2 years before their death. And I mean, my question is, do you think Gorky, when he was making this piece, I think it's a really great example, but the estimate seems, I think, very, very good. Because some other Gorky works on papers are, I don't know, like million to 1.5.
This is for
but
Max.
this is really good example. But from your art historical perspective, like what do you think of this piece?
I think this is more a question from.
We didn't rehearse this. I don't know this man. This is fine. It's a very good estimate. Jed, yeah, I think your question is about what makes this piece special. I mean, it is, as you say, it's 2 years before his death. It's 1946. It's lot. What is it? I think you just passed it there. It's lot 9. There, I mean, Gorky had for those of you who don't know who Arshil Gorky is, he was born in Armenia. He moved to America. He's one of the great hinge figures who, more than pretty much any other of these other artists in exile, really, he was sort of like when he was influenced by an artist, he essentially did that artist for a period. So he did Miró, he did Picasso. He was very, and at this point there was a series of tragedies in his life. His studio in New York on the Upper East Side, actually on 95th Street and 5th Avenue, which you can, I mean, it's a privately owned apartment you can still go to. That's where he went when his studio burned down in Connecticut. He'd had horrible health problems. His wife had an affair with Mata. It was kind of a, so these are as you say, these last great things before the end. This is in Virginia.
I hesitate to too much associate what an artist does so a couple of years before their death with suicide. So I mean, I don't think Gorky wanted to die I don't think Gorky wanted to die. He hung himself, which is a kind of cry of help, for help, really. He was a very gentle man. It's funny. He lived near the Calders in Roxbury, Connecticut, for a time, and Calder's older daughter, who I became very good friends with, she said Gorky was one of the visitors who was really nice to children. She was a child. That's the kind of thing.
That's a nice quality.
What?
That's a nice quality. I mean, you could. I think this is in the book, but Calder didn't like Picasso because he was a bad father.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think
when
that's
finally asked what they did not have a relationship, but he said, Picasso was a bad father, and Calder was wonderful. Calder was a wonderful father. Yeah.
Anyone else have a? Yes, Jen.
I think one of the beautiful surprises of the book, of the collection, is the Lucy Reed pottery downstairs.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are, how that's connected to the fine art, or if you do see connections.
So the question was about the Lucy Reed pottery downstairs, which is not part of this sale, which will be sold in the December design sale.
No, Lucy Reed, I mean, is part of this, I think, a reimagining of the crafts traditions, of the making of things other than paintings, that goes very much along with the whole reimagining of the possibilities of the visual world in the first decades of the 20th century. I mean, the Bauhaus, where several of the people who, in this, like Kandinsky and Klee, both taught, the mission of the Bauhaus was to reconceive the whole our whole world, our architecture, our daily objects, our precious objects, our paintings and sculpture, our theater, in this spirit I talked about at the beginning of kind of a new vision of these of reinventing what the world can look like. And someone like Lucy Reed is in some way a part of that you take something like a vessel which is supposed to hold cider or something, or hold your porridge, and you rethink it, its shape, its form, and you also rethink it somewhat apart from functionality, in the same sense that the modern artist rethinks the figure apart from portraiture, from the function of a portrait. So I think it's very much a part of that same spirit. And the photographs you have in the catalog of the house, I think you very much feel that. And I have to say, it goes to the furniture and the sort of very austere, but I think very elegant, in a very simple way, interior. It's a kind of, I don't know if the furniture is Knoll, or it's sort of, it's Knoll, which is basically the American reimagining of the Bauhaus. So it all fits together, and I think Lucy Reed is very much a part of that. You take something ancient, and Lucy was very interested in ancient ways of making pots and glazes and all that, just as Picasso was interested in ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, and you reimagine it in the light of modern times.
Well, thank you so much. I have a footnote that the 1943 Calder retrospective at MoMA, the great, unique wooden constellation just before you get to the Weis collection, was in that at MoMA. So when you see it on your way out, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Jed, and thank you, Colleen, Jennifer, and Jonathan. I'm very honored.